Welcome to the Bookman's Corner. I'm Lois Lindstrom. Today we will discuss a book that is a fresh and vibrant account of an event during the Civil War that had enduring consequences that still resonate today. And that book is A Fierce Glory, Antietam, the desperate battle that saved Lincoln and doomed slavery by Justin Martin. So nice to have you here, Justin.
Nice to be here.
This is an excellent book focusing on an epic battle fought near Sharpsburg, Maryland, that was a Civil War turning point. The South had just launched its first invasion of the North, and victory for Robert E. Lee would almost certainly have ended the war on Confederate terms. If the Union prevailed, Lincoln stood ready to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. The Union won this battle, but the horrors and heroes of this monumental battle, one that killed 3,650 soldiers, is still the highest single-day toll in American history. Justin, why is Antietam so important?
It was such a consequential battle. Whichever side won was likely, particularly if the Confederates won, it would have probably ended the Civil War right then and there.
I mean, the war would have ended if the Confederates won.
Very likely, for a number of reasons, because of possible interference by England and France, who were standing by waiting for one more Union victory, one more Union loss rather. Also because the kind of the effort, the commitment to the war was kind of waning in the North, and so the a Union loss could have really sort of changed the equation.
Interesting.
Address
Well, I love what you did in this book. It's a really a great read, and I am not a Civil War buff, but I just went right through it. It was excellent.
Oh, thank you.
And why was Antietam a more critical battle than Gettysburg?
It's more critical because it would have, whichever side won was likely going to win the war. Certainly if the Confederacy had won, that would have ended the war probably then and there. And kind of the simple answer is, had it not been for Antietam, had the Union lost at Antietam, the war probably wouldn't have lasted long enough for there to even be a Gettysburg.
Well, you know, what was fascinating to read in your book was the fact that the South was going to be recognized by European powers, and they could have gotten involved. And I didn't realize that.
No, very much. England and France were standing by. They England in particular, having fought a war with the colonials just less than 100 years before, they sort of liked the idea that the United States had lost control of its nation, had slipped into fratricidal warfare, and that England was going to need to step in and kind of
take over.
Take over, exactly,
Yeah.
and force a peace.
So that would have been a dramatic, different history for us. Well, how is your book different than others about this battle?
The main way it's different is what I described at the outset, which is it's a narrative, so I'm telling a story, and I tried to work into the story sort of some modern elements. Like, as I said, I tried to kind of strip right into the narrative Lincoln and his thinking about slavery and his coming around to issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. The way I saw it is, if this is a battle where the stakes of the battle are something that happens off stage, as it were, the issuing of the Emancipation Proclamation, and how important that was to the Civil War.
And also in your book, you wrote about two major medical innovators in this battle. Who were they, and what were their contributions to medicine?
Well, one was Clara Barton, and Clara Barton, this was her debut, as it were. She really wanted to go right to the front lines and attend to soldiers, wounded soldiers.
She was a nurse, right?
She was a nurse, that's right, and so
she was from Massachusetts?
She was from Massachusetts, and she'd been a teacher, and before the Civil War, and so a lot of her students were actually fighting, including at Antietam. So she.
So it's amazing. She traveled right to the battlefield, right?
Traveled right to the battlefield and went right to the front lines. In fact, which is something that's what she wanted to do. She didn't want to be back at the rear like so many nurses were, taking care of soldiers after the battle. She wanted to be, taking care of them as the fighting was going on.
And who was the other medical innovator? Was it?
The other one was Jonathan Letterman, who's the
That's
Union
right.
medical director. He made his debut at Antietam, and he brought with him some world-changing ideas. I'll give you one brief one, which was, triage. Such a simple idea, but before this, the Union had been kind of chaotic about that. And so
What is triage exactly?
Triage is as simple as that person who can be saved, save them. Someone who's a goner, you're going to have to. It's medical prioritizing.
I see.
And he really impressed upon his surgeons before the battle. As simple of an idea as it was, if someone can be saved, save them. If someone's a goner, summon the chaplain, give them some morphine to ease their pain. And that had to be that. It's kind of a cold, cruel calculus, but it was very necessary to saving lives.
Now, when exactly did Lincoln issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which is like 719 words, which I learned about in your book? How did the proclamation impact the Union Army?
Well, he issued it. He issued what was called the preliminary proclamation on September 22nd of 1862, and then the final proclamation on January 1st of 1863. And to your question, the reason he did it in this preliminary and then final form was to give the Union Army time and to give the North time to kind of accept and adopt this idea. As you might imagine, the country, not only was the country divided into the Confederacy and the Union states, but within the Union there were divisions between those who wanted to end slavery and those who kind of had a laissez-faire attitude about it. They didn't care whether the South had slavery or not. And so issuing this Emancipation Proclamation, it was necessary to get buy-in from the North. And so that took time, but Lincoln played it very well by having a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, and 100 days later, the final one gave people time to kind of
He was very good politically, wasn't he?
He was extraordinarily astute politically, and
Yes.
really all of Antietam was, in a way, his finest moment, or one of his finest moments politically.
Yeah. And you wrote that at this period was particularly tough for President Lincoln because of an illness in the family. Can you give us more details?
Well, for Lincoln, it was more than an illness in the family. It was the death of his son. Willie was his favorite son. Willie was the son that was most like Lincoln, and he was devastated by Willie's death. At the same time, you could say that it gave him, I mean, Lincoln was always an empathetic person, but the loss of his son during wartime gave him an extreme empathy for the parents who were losing children in the battle, and also for those soldiers who were dying. So it was kind of a gift of empathy that came out of this terrible, terrible event.
Yeah. Now, Justin, were you interested in Civil War books as a child, and what was your favorite book on this war?
Well, you know what? I can't claim that I really was all that interested, certainly as a child, in Civil War books, although as an adult I've read quite a few. And my favorite book is actually a work of fiction, the Red Badge, a work of historical fiction, the Red Badge of Courage by Stephen Crane. And it provided, I felt like, even though my book is nonfiction, I thought that kind of dramatic telling was a good guidepost to aim for.
And I want to ask you, why did you choose the title of Fierce Glory? That's very interesting.
I liked kind of the apposition of glory, and in this case I thought fierceness to uphold something glorious like in this case the Emancipation Proclamation, giving the war a new and nobler cause, also required a ferocity on the part of Lincoln and of course on the part of the people who were fighting that day.
Well, can you describe the military camps back then? What did they look like?
Well, the soldiers, a lot of times, particularly on the night of the battle, camp was pretty modest, and camp wasn't really camp. An awful lot of the soldiers, both North and South, simply slept on the ground the night before the battle. There's one very compelling instance of a Georgia brigade, about 1,000 men sleeping in a ditch the night before, in their clothing, muskets beside them, in battle formation, so that when they got up the next day, they were ready to fight, basically. So, no, it wasn't. There would be camping before Antietam and after Antietam, but the night before the battle, just given the circumstances, an awful lot of men were just in the open air.
Amazing, amazing. Well, what really inspired you to write this? Did you read something that made you feel like I've got to follow up and do something about this?
The Battle of Antietam made cameos in each of my previous books and kind of got me interested and had me researching the topic. I did a previous book on Frederick Law Olmsted, who, although he's best known as the landscape architect of Central Park and a lot of other landscape creations around the country, he's also head of a Civil War medical unit that was at Antietam. I also wrote a book on Walt Whitman and a group of bohemians who hung out in New York City in a bar called Pfaff's during the Civil War, and news of Antietam reached them, caused them just to drink and feel glad that they weren't in the battle.
There, that's right, not there, that's right.
Although Walt Whitman's brother, actually, who was with the New York regiment, did fight at Antietam. So Whitman and wrote letters home that Whitman read. So I felt like as I said, I felt like the battle made significant cameos in each of my previous books, and I became very intrigued by it for the reasons that many people have been intrigued with. With it over the years. What a violent battle it was, what the high death toll it had, how significant it was.
Incredible.
Kind of drew me in.
Now, who were your favorite military officers of this conflict?
Well, for Antietam, officers who I've grown to have an appreciation for, such as U.S. Grant, were not present at Antietam. So Antietam doesn't have the best performances on the part of the Union. But I guess I'd say I have a sympathy or an appreciation of Ambrose Burnside, who did lead, a crucial movement during the battle, where he got the Union soldiers across Antietam Creek. But even Ambrose Burnside wouldn't comport himself with much distinction only a month hence at the Battle of Fredericksburg. So it wasn't a great showing for the Union, I'd say.
Well, what I thought was so funny in your description of Ambrose Burnside was the fact that he had all this hair along his ears, and that's where they came up with sideburns. The name sideburns.
Exactly. It's just flipping the syllables in his last name, and it was he was not the greatest general, but he was a hairstyle innovator with his what would come to be known as sideburns.
So what was Jeb Stewart like? Wasn't he a West Point graduate?
I believe Jeb Stewart was a West Point graduate. He didn't, cavalry didn't play a big role at Antietam, so he basically stood by at the battle. However, as you may well know, he was Lee's just very talented,
guy. Yeah, right.
Very talented cavalryman. And so about a month after the battle, he rode all the way around. He rode around McClellan's entire army, who were at this point just camped near Antietam, just as a kind of reconnaissance mission, but also as an opportunity to kind of do some raiding. They raided Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, and some other towns, came away with a lot of guns and ammo and so forth. So Jeb Stewart showed his great talent as a cavalry officer about a month after the battle. But the Battle of Antietam itself wasn't a big cavalry conflict.
Why did Robert E. Lee decide to invade the North?
So to invade the North because it was, the timing was right. The Union was in quite a losing streak, and he perceived that there are quite a few advantages that could accrue to the Confederacy if they were to win on Union soil. One of the most significant ones being, I'll mention right now, was he hoped, Lee was a very astute student of the Yankee press and Yankee sentiment. He rightly perceived that at this point that the North was kind of wearying of the war effort. And the midterms, it was no accident that the battle happened in September. The midterms were only about 8 weeks away, and Lee perceived that if he could win on Northern soil, that it might affect the midterms, and that Lincoln's party, which were the Republicans who held both chambers of Congress at that point, maybe the out party, the Democrats, would be voted in. And Lee perceived that the Democrats, they might hobble, they might serve as a check on Lincoln, hobbling his war agenda, maybe even extending an olive branch to the Confederacy, inviting the Confederacy back into the Union with slavery intact. So one of the many things Lee had in mind with this invasion was interfering with the midterms, which were important then as they are today.
And he understood the importance of publicity, right?
Yeah, he certainly did. He understood that this battle, it wouldn't just be, obviously a battlefield defeat for the Union would be terrible in the human toll, but it also would be a public relations nightmare, as it were, for the Union government, for Lincoln's government.
Right. And I remember from high school history that Robert E. Lee's plans to invade the North fell into Union hands. Tell us about that story.
Well, it wasn't his plans to invade the North. He'd actually already invaded the North, and that was a bit of a surprise.
Antietam,
He'd already entered Maryland. However, his plan to do something very clever, which was to divide his army up and have them sent in different places. So the army that he invaded Maryland, sending some of them to Harper's Ferry and some of them other parts.
Right.
And he intended to, for instance, to attack Harper's Ferry, which is a big arsenal, and steal weapons and so forth. That plan, which was wrapped around he actually gave versions of the plan to all of his major generals, A.P. Hill and D.H. Hill and so forth. But one of those generals, somehow, the plan was wrapped in 3 cigars, and it got left on the ground, and an Indiana private, a private from an Indiana regiment from the Union, found the plan, brought it to McClellan, the Union commander's headquarters. McClellan had with him at his headquarters someone who was a colleague or had worked with Lee before the Civil War, and he verified, yes, that's Lee's handwriting.
Oh, wow.
And so now they knew, they knew where Lee was in Maryland, where he was intending to go.
And how many troops he had, probably.
They had a notion of how many troops he had, and they certainly knew their disposition, where they were going. McClellan, who is known for being notoriously pokey, he just really sped up at that point. He knew where Lee was going and wanted to cut him off.
Well, please tell us why Antietam in 1862 was more heated, more savage, more consequential? I'm using your words.
My words are, yeah. I would say the reason why, there are a couple reasons. The broad reason why was because you had sort of Napoleonic battlefield formations and techniques being employed by these West Point graduated generals, both sides, North and South, that put the men into very close confines with one another, and yet they were using weaponry, rifled muskets now, not old-fashioned smoothbore muskets, that were much more accurate. So you had men sometimes standing 100 yards apart, firing long-range weapons. So that was, you know, part of the cause, and then what you have to add to it. So any battle that would have been fought in the Civil War had this issue, but in the case of Antietam, it was being fought in the tight confines of this valley. The topography really drove the men into close conflict
So
with
they were
each
really,
other.
it was almost like hand-to-hand combat, except they were, but they were using guns.
They were using guns. They were using guns at very close range. They were following formations that were very kind of, as I said, they were kind of outdated and Napoleonic in some cases, and they were doing things like going up over a ridge. When they get to the other side of the ridge, they'd suddenly be, you know, almost face to face with the enemy, and so you had men, because of the topography, forced into very close confines for the fighting.
Now, what about the significance of Alexander Gardner's Antietam battlefield photographs?
Gardner was a great innovator who was on the battlefield, and his photographs, they were kind of the first stark dispatch of what this battle really looked like, what battle really looked like. I mean, prior to this, people were dependent on illustrations. That
Sketches.
appeared, sketches.
Right.
And those sketches were often wildly romanticized. You'd have a general holding his sword and somebody holding the flag. Everybody would look orderly and neat and brave. And Gardner's photographs, by contrast, were so stark. This is what dead soldiers looked like. It was very brutal. It was a first peek at this.
Devastation,
At this devastation for so many people. They were widely distributed in the North. In a way, you can say that they worked in tandem with the Emancipation Proclamation, because the Emancipation Proclamation gave a new, more nobler purpose to the war, freeing the slaves. The photographs kind of communicated, if this is the terrible cost of warfare, we need to invest this fighting with a new, more noble purpose.
And we need to win, right?
And we need to win, yes, and we need to do it quickly. We can't,
quickly.
We can't
right.
dally.
And then your descriptions of the Lincoln White House and the mass of people visiting it was very interesting. Can you give us a quick description of what the mansion looked like during Lincoln's presidency during this period?
Well, the mansion looked substantially the same as it does now, with the difference being it was in a kind of state of Mary Todd Lincoln, his wife. She had intended, she had very high-flowing, rich tastes, French tapestries,
She
Asian
wanted to
rugs.
redecorate.
She wanted to redecorate it. And so it was in a state of half redecoration, which is very kind of unsettling, and it communicated the sadness that had befallen the family, because she was about halfway through her very expensive renovation to the White House when Willie died, and she was devastated.
And she became very depressed.
She became extremely depressed, would spend days at a time in her bedroom, not coming out. And so you had this very strange, where you had, you had some of the grand refurbishing she planned had been accomplished, but other parts of it were left undone, and so it created a kind of half-done atmosphere.
You're right. Well, and to quote from your book, so many wounded soldiers dying in agony, it was nothing but pain and grief. Well, how did the residents of Sharpsburg, Maryland respond to this?
It was first terrifying for those. Now, many of the residents, I should mention, they had advance warning. They heard that the troops came in. They heard fighting in the passes that led into Antietam Valley. So many of them had fled to neighbors or friends. Some of them chose to stay. Those who chose to stay, they took refuge during the battle. Absolutely terrifying for them. And I should mention, this was Maryland. Maryland was a border state that had stayed in the Union, but with slavery intact. And so you had, in the town of Sharpsburg, you had both slaveholders, or certainly Confederate sympathizers, and you had Union sympathizers, sometimes as next door neighbors to one another. Those who stayed, kind of tried to ride out the battle with stark terror.
Well, I was amazed that they would say, welcome the soldiers from the Union to spend the night, and then the next day they would welcome the Confederates to spend the night. In other words, they were playing both sides.
That is correct. Not necessarily in Sharpsburg, because Sharpsburg only experiences the battle, but as Lee's troops were making their way through Maryland, yes, indeed, because it was a divided state. When it was the Union pursuing the Confederates. So first the Confederates would come through, and if you were a Confederate sympathizer, you'd fly your flag high, and you might go out to the square and offer them some baked goods or whatever. And then when the Union pursuing them came through a few days later, those Confederates, they took their flags down. They certainly didn't want to identify themselves and draw the ire of the Union soldiers. And now the Union sympathizers would raise their flags. So yes, that was sort of the lead up to the battle.
Amazing. And now, also, it's interesting, the Slade, an African-American man who worked in the White House in the early 1860s as a usher, how did he affect President Lincoln?
Well, he affected President Lincoln. Slade was a White House employee. He was an African-American. He was paid for his work. He was close in age to Lincoln. He had a kind of a similar personality. He liked to tell jokes, liked to tell long, rambling stories. And by virtue of that, he and Lincoln actually became not just employer-employee, but friends. And Lincoln shared with, he and Slade, Lincoln enjoyed hearing Slade's stories and jokes. But because Slade was an African-American, Lincoln also discussed what was in a kind of a secret plan with Slade to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln had only shared this with some members of his cabinet and close associates, but because Slade was an African-American, he also served as kind of a sounding board to Lincoln, and Lincoln discussed the thorny issue of slavery with him, and also mentioned to him that talked with him about his intention of issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. When I was doing my research, I came across some old Slade family lore that indicated that when Lincoln finally issued the Emancipation Proclamation, Slade had memorized every last word.
Amazing, amazing. And there are also many interesting historical images in your book, many from the Library of Congress. Now, how did you select the images to use?
I selected images. I actually tried to tell a narrative. I always I like photo inserts where they kind of tell a story. So I tried to pick images of Lincoln and Willie and Alexander Gardner, the photographer, and of course Robert E. Lee and McClellan, the generals, and I tried to arrange them in a way that you could actually,
It's excellent the way you've done that.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
So that you could actually get a kind of an outline of the story of the battle and the various participants by looking at the photo insert.
And your description of General McClellan drew me into your narrative. Please describe his tough relationship with Lincoln and how Lincoln fired him.
Yeah. Well, I described earlier that you had a kind of divided, even though you had a divided nation, divided into a Confederacy and the Union, you also had a divided North, divided in some ways between Republicans and Democrats, with everything being flipped at that point. The Republicans were the progressive party, the abolitionists. The Democrats were more conservative and more laissez-faire about slavery. Well, Lincoln's general, McClellan, was in fact a Democrat, and he was very laissez-faire about slavery. He wanted to restore the Union, and he certainly...
Did he own slaves?
No, he didn't own slaves. He borrowed a slave once, which is a kind of a bizarre thing. Going to the Mexican War, he visited one of his relatives in Alabama, and he borrowed a slave who he took with him to the Mexican War and had the man groom his horse and cook him meals. And as you might imagine, there's no record of him paying the borrowed slave.
Not, yeah.
I doubt he did. He wasn't very anti-slavery. He wanted to restore the Union. If the Union was restored with slavery intact, that would have been fine with McClellan. And so, of course, this put him at odds with Lincoln, because Lincoln wanted to prosecute the war. He was increasingly wanting to prosecute the war with more intensity and with a different purpose. While McClellan was sort of for limited war, just trying to bring the Confederacy back into the fold.
And he really loved his men, so I guess he didn't want them to get hurt in battle, right?
That's right. McClellan was a master, just a master at training men. He was excellent at it, and he would put together these kind of, you might call it a pristine army, well trained, and he liked to have them parade in front of him, do these grand reviews. But the actual notion of having his men fight in battle was very unsettling for him, which also had a very attractive attribute to it. It meant that McClellan cared about his men. He did not. He brought in a lot of medical innovations to make sure that they didn't suffer unduly.
And well, tell us about Arlington, Lee's home, which became a graveyard for Union soldiers. I mean, Lee loved this house, and he never returned to it.
That's correct. Arlington. Which was, in sight of the White House and many other Capitol Hill.
Beautiful mansion.
Beautiful mansion, and this was Lee's mansion. And very early in the war, the Union concluded they were going to have to seize Arlington and the surrounding community, because it really posed a threat in rebel Virginia to various targets. They could place cannons and they could hit the White House or the Capitol or what have you. And so the Union seized Lee's home.
Yes.
And Lee was devastated by this.
Yes, he loved it. Yeah.
Yeah, he loved his home. And it really, the seizure of his home did a lot to turn Lee, who started the war simply as a Virginian supporting his state of Virginia against the United States, the actual seizing of his home, and sort of in some cases, it was kind of ransacked for various
so he
treasures.
hated the Union.
Exactly. This did more to radicalize Lee and turn him into a true rebel, you might say, than anything else.
Now, also, I'd like for you to briefly describe the Battle of Antietam. They fought savagely for 7 hours, and then both sides took a break. It was 75 degrees Fahrenheit, and what a ghastly spectacle. What can you tell us what it was like?
Yeah, what it was like was, and I base this on the accounts of many soldiers, was just deafening. It was there was
really
the sound
loud.
of cannons. Sound of cannons, and there were two distinct sounds I found very fascinating. Or actually three distinct sounds. There was the sound of cannons, there was a sound of muskets, and the musketry was so intense that I heard I came across one great description describing it like being a piece of canvas being torn. So pop, 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 just constant muskets, cannons, and then the whinnies of horses, that were being shot.
Of course,
above.
horses were dying all over the place.
Horses dying all over the place. So that was, sound, also acrid smoke that burned ones that had saltpeter, one of the gunpowder ingredients, black powder ingredients, burning people's, mouth and lungs. Limited visibility due to both the severe topography and also the smoke everywhere. And then, of course, all this, so sound and smoke and terror. People were just terrified, with this bullets whizzing everywhere and cannon shells exploding overhead. So it was a very intensive, experience for people.
I bet. And then I thought it was great that you added the last chapter titled Further Explorations. Antietam Battlefield is a national park and national treasure. And can you tell us why it's worth seeing? In other words, it's easy to visit, isn't it?
It's easy to visit, and it's just spectacularly preserved. One of the things that's really awesome about it is it's a 3,000 acre
3,000 acres,
yep.
Wow.
So it's kind of, it's the size of a large park, and it is in effect a park. And they've done it's a national park, and they've done a masterful job of maintaining so many elements, like say the Burnside Bridge, which was a famous place where the Union was finally able to break through and cross. It's still the original 1830s bridge is still there, beautifully preserved. There are what are called witness trees on the battlefield. Those are trees that were young saplings.
Witness trees.
Yeah, they're called witness trees because they were there for the battle. Now they're old, wise trees, but they were
and they're still there.
And they're still there. There are a handful of them. They're marked. You can see them. And it's just, the battlefield is so well preserved. And one of the wonderful things is, if someone goes in with some foreknowledge, the battlefield becomes so animated because you can see, you can visit a place where a particular piece of the action took place.
Well, Justin, where can our viewers in Arlington find your book?
It's available in all the typical places, including online vendors, and also certainly can visit my website, which is justinmartin1.com, as in numeral one.
Well, thank you so much for being a guest on our program.
Oh, my pleasure. I enjoyed talking with you.
Loved it.
Thank you.
And please join us again next month for another edition of the Bookman's Corner. Thank you for watching. I'm Lois Lindstrom.